Alright, time for Chapter 8 about thinking, reasoning, and language. So what exactly is thinking? Thinking is any mental activity or processing of information, including learning, remembering, perceiving, communicating, believing, and deciding. As we saw in Chapter 6, behaviorists tried to explain all human behavior through stimulus and response, reinforcement, and punishment. And it wasn't until more modern theories accounted for thinking. So due to the number and complexity of our everyday activities, our brains have streamlined the process, conserving as much energy as possible. The main way our brains do this is through the use of heuristics or mental shortcuts. There's likely an evolutionary component to this. For example, the heuristic of avoiding strangers likely has roots in warring tribes where individuals would likely avoid each other or those they didn't know. We process an immense amount of information every single day, so we can't actively attend to and process each individual stimulus. I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but our brains do this weird gap-filling thing to help us process information more quickly. It highlights certain aspects of a stimulus or event, and then fills in the gaps based on previous experience of similar stimuli and events. Heuristics are similar, but not quite the same. Heuristics are the previous information our brains use to perform shortcuts. They act as a roadmap of experiences and help us save energy by helping us quickly process information. This is called cognitive economy, and it helps keep us spending the least amount of mental resources as we can. One study found that untrained observers can make surprisingly accurate judgments about people based on limited information. They were able to accurately assess emotional stability, openness to new experiences, and conscientiousness. Another study referred to our ability to extract useful information from small bits of behavior as thin slicing. Unfortunately, our ability to do things quickly may lead to faulty conclusions. This is how many psychopaths and serial killers were able to manipulate their victims. They fit what we know as an upstanding citizen, but are the entire opposite. So, actually getting into heuristics, cognitive bias is a systematic error in thinking. Representativeness heuristic is a heuristic that involves judging the probability of an event by its superficial similarity to a prototype. Stereotyping is another technique used by our brains to conserve resources, but they can be misleading. If we rely on how well someone fits a stereotype to classify them, that is relying on the representativeness heuristic. As I'm sure you're aware by now, stereotypes are often inaccurate when it comes to people, but they can be useful for situations. For example, you can stereotype your pet's behavior with some accuracy. If they're sleeping or calm and relaxed, then you can probably guess with some certainty that they're content. If they're running around like a gremlin, you can probably guess they want to play. What makes this heuristic challenging is people in general do not do a good job at accounting for base rate information, and base rate information is how common a characteristic or behavior is in the general population. This means that when making judgments about representativeness, we tend to not consider how common something is across the population in general. Related to this, we have the availability heuristic, which is a heuristic that involves estimating the likelihood of an occurrence based on the ease with which it comes to our minds. Basically, this is how quickly we can think of an example, aka how available it is in our memory. We estimate how common an event is based on how readily we can think of an example. For example, one study found that those who were asked to estimate the homicide rate of Detroit estimated higher numbers than those asked to estimate the homicide rate of the entire state of Michigan. And then we have the hindsight bias, which is the tendency to overestimate how well we could have predicted something after it already happened. This is where the phrase hindsight is 20/20 comes from. I knew that was going to happen. I'm guilty of doing this too, especially with horror movies, other spooky stuff like, oh no, there's a ghost in the basement. Who would have guessed? So, and that's an example of hindsight bias. So top-down processing is when we fill gaps from missing information based on previous experience and background knowledge. To demonstrate this, I'm going to show you a few unfinished doodles I made in PowerPoint, and I want you to try to guess what each one is. So first of all, we have the one on the far left. I'm going to give you a few seconds just to kind of think of when it might be, come up with maybe some guesses. So for the first one, if you guessed a house, you're right. All it's missing is the second part of the roof, maybe a window, and it's a house. Right, so for the second one, same thing. I'm going to give you a couple seconds, think about it, come up with some guesses. So for the second one, if you guessed a star, that was a horrible line, you would be correct. And last but not least, we have the one on the far right. This one should be fairly easy, but it might also throw you for a loop, so I'll give you a few seconds for this one as well. For this one, if you guessed pizza, you would be correct. So, and these are just all examples of top-down processing. This is different from bottom-up processing, which is when our brain processes only the information it receives and constructs meaning from it slowly but surely by building up understanding through experience. One type of top-down processing is called chunking, and it's a memory aid that relies on our ability to organize information into larger units, expanding the span and detail of our memories. Then we also have concepts and schemas. Both of these help us think and reason. So for concepts, our knowledge and ideas about a set of objects, actions, and characteristics that share core properties. These help us organize events that share common core features like going to a restaurant, going on vacation, etc. As we acquire knowledge, we create schemas that enable us to know roughly what to expect in a given situation. While these aren't foolproof, they do aid us in exerting less cognitive effort over basic knowledge, freeing us to engage in more complex reasoning and emotional processing. So how does language influence our thoughts? Sometimes we think in words. Talking in our heads or to ourselves are both very common. Some theorists believe you can't think without language. And this approach is called linguistic determinism, a view that all thought is represented verbally, and that as a result, our language defines our thinking. Some evidence for this is the fact that kids can perform complex cognitive tasks long before they can actually articulate them. Additionally, neuroimaging studies show that although language areas often become activated when people engage in certain cognitive tasks like reading, and then a similar, less radical approach is called linguistic relativity, which is the view that characteristics of language shape our thought processes. This is also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. There's evidence both for and against this idea. So when recalling information about Russia, participants were more accurate when they were speaking Russian. Conversely, color categorization doesn't seem to be very affected by language. So that's a good segue for what we're going to be moving into next in a little bit. So decision making. This is the process of selecting among a set of possible alternatives. So most decision making seems straightforward. It's either option A or option B. This is typically thought of as System 1 thinking, which is rapid and intuitive. The other type is System 2 thinking, which involves analytical and slow thinking, truly weighing your options. For example, making a pros and cons list. Each system of thinking has its advantages and disadvantages. System 1 decision making can lead to rushed, misinformed decisions, whereas System 2 decision making can lead to an overwhelming amount of information. However, when it comes to scientific thinking and decisions in the research process, System 2 is preferred. It allows us to be more measured and less biased when appropriately weighing all of our options. Outside of the situation, framing also influences our decision making. So framing is the way a question is formulated, and this can influence the decisions people make. I've made the joke before, but phrasing is really important, especially when it comes to decision making. Next, we have problem solving. So one of the tools of problem solving is algorithms, which are step-by-step learned procedures used to solve a problem. And these come in handy when problems that depend on the same basic steps for arriving at a solution every time the solution is required. These make sure we address all steps when we solve a problem, but they aren't very flexible. A more flexible approach would be to break down a problem into subproblems. They're easier to solve. By breaking it down into chunks, we can solve the problem more easily and effectively. A lot of breakthroughs come in the form of analogies between two different topics. These help us solve problems with similar structures. Another approach is distributed cognition, which is where group problem solving, and this is when multiple minds work together, bouncing ideas off of each other, each contributing different ideas, knowledge, and perspectives. This way, group discussions and think tanks are beneficial. Different perspectives can provide new insight into an old problem. And yes, I had to include Scooby-Doo. Now, some obstacles to problem solving. So first we have salience to surface similarities. So salience is how attention-grabbing something is. We tend to focus our attention on surface level or very superficial properties of a problem. Ignoring superficial details can be problematic because it can make solving the problem more challenging. Another obstacle is mental sets. This is a phenomenon of becoming stuck in a specific problem-solving strategy, inhibiting our ability to generate alternatives. A good example of this would be solving a bunch of word search problems and then being asked to solve Sudoku and struggling because your brain is still in word search mode. One study found that giving people jars to manipulate helped overcome mental sets. The next one is functional fixedness, which is difficulty conceptualizing that an object typically used for one purpose can be used for another. And this can be a problem for some more than others. For example, those who might have grown up without a lot of money tend to be more resourceful, and this is less of an issue for them. It still can be an issue. I want to make that very clear. It can potentially be an issue for everyone. But for those that grew up without a lot of money, without money to replace poorly functioning or broken items, people tend to use ingenuity to either fix the item or find something else that'll do the same job. Personally, for me, growing up, as long as something could be fixed using WD-40 or duct tape, it wasn't really broken. This also tends to be less of a problem for those adept at solving puzzles. They've already trained their brain to think outside the box to solve problems. One profession very adept at solving puzzles is people in the culinary field. For anyone that's seen Chopped, Hell's Kitchen, MasterChef, or Cutthroat Kitchen, you know exactly what I mean. For anyone not familiar with Chopped, the chefs are given a box of 4 mystery ingredients and must make an awesome dish containing all 4 items. The most extreme cases are the viewer's choice episodes. So I've attached a link to one of the episodes in case anyone's interested and doesn't have access to Hulu. Unfortunately, viewer choice episode that I wanted to feature is purchase or rent only through YouTube, but it is available on Hulu. So, but yeah, for anyone curious, highly recommend you click the link, give it a look. Right, next we have models of the mind. So for a while, psychologists believed our brains ran like computers. Put data in, get data out. However, as I'm sure you know, technology, especially computers, are prone to error, as is human thinking. While some modern psychologists still prefer this approach, others believe this analogy doesn't do a good job of explaining human thinking. For example, most neurotypical and able-bodied individuals can perceive speech just fine, but if you've ever tried to use voice commands for a computer or automated service, you know computers don't really do a great job when it comes to recognizing human speech, especially for anyone that has an accent. This is one domain where people perform far better than computers, because we take into account context and we can draw inferences. This is also why, if you use subtitles on my lectures, you can probably spot where what I'm saying doesn't exactly line up with what YouTube thinks I'm saying sometimes. Computers also have a harder time reasoning. Granted, in the era of artificial intelligence, this is somewhat changing. But if you ask a computer a simple question like, is the sky blue? It can answer that with a good degree of accuracy. However, if you ask it something like, is a hot dog a taco? It's going to struggle. Fun fact, this is one of my favorite arguments to start with people. Next time you really want to have a trivial argument with someone, bring this up. The other side of this argument is that hot dogs are technically sandwiches, but those people are wrong, but it's okay. To demonstrate this, if you Google, is a hot dog or a taco, depending on which side of the aisle you fall on, you'll get something very similar to what I have here on the left. Notice all the results were written by people. It doesn't provide a generic Google answer like it does when you ask, is the sky blue, which is the image on the right. So I asked it, is the sky blue? While it did pull up a good amount of sources written by people, it also pulled up this generic Google answer, describing the sky blue the color because it's the color of the sky. And notice, there is no generic Google answer about is a hot dog a taco. There's no little automatically generated box that pops up when you type that in. Another example is that computers don't have an opportunity to explore and experience the world in the way humans can. So computers only know what we tell them, whereas each individual person on Earth has their own set of unique experiences based on how they've explored the world. I do want to clarify that when I say world, it is in reference to one's own surroundings, not the whole world, literally. So recent models have tried to account for these discrepancies by developing embodied accounts of thinking. These believe that our knowledge is organized and accessed in a manner that enables us to simulate our actual experiences. This approach is consistent with neuroimaging studies. These studies show how the brain's sensory areas become activated when people think about objects, actions, and events. Our cognitive processing is really flexible and creative, taking advantage of past experience, context, imagination, and mental shortcuts to provide us with rapid and efficient solutions to problems. But it can also lead us astray. This is why it's important to think for yourself, do your own research, account for sources of information, and develop your own theories and ideas. Remember, y'all, Uncle Dave is not a credible source, but the Department of Justice is. So a lot of people tend to think that words have fixed meanings, like in the dictionary, but as popular culture and the internet have shown us, that's just not true. A lot of misunderstanding can happen by using the wrong word or simply using the wrong form of a given word, like effect and affect, or the wrong there. So language is a largely arbitrary system of communication that combines symbols in a rule-based way to create meaning. So obviously in different languages, words can have different meanings or connotations. However, this can occur within a language as well. I'm going to use my own experience as an example. So I grew up in East Texas, which is heavily influenced by other cultures, such as Cajun culture, and to some extent French Cajun culture as well. So for example, my family has always, as long as I can remember, called shopping carts buggies, which I thought was what everyone called them until I moved to San Antonio. When I got here, I learned that people call them carts. Another example is the fact that people in San Antonio call the highway access road either the access road or the frontage road. In East Texas, it's called the feeder road because it feeds into the highway. As we move through this portion of the chapter, I want y'all to think of some examples that may have occurred in your own life. If you're willing to share, I would love to hear them, so feel free to leave a comment. So language serves several important functions. First being the transmission of information, the actual words you use, as well as any context provided by body language or signs convey a specific message. The second is it allows us to convey our thoughts and feelings to those around us, because people can't read minds unless they're in a Stan Lee story. And for those not aware, I'm referencing X-Men. So the features of language and how we develop it. So scientists believe language to be an automatic process and that typically we don't have to think too hard about how to pronounce a given word in our native language. I say native language because I don't feel it's fair to generalize across native languages and non-native languages when it comes to some of these ideas and processes. As someone who has tried and do not do well at learning a second language, I can assure you that the process is not automatic until you become fluent in it, which takes a great deal of time and practice. As they mentioned in the chapter, we don't realize how complex language is until we try to learn a new one, especially for anyone attempting to learn English as a second language, because English isn't really a language, it's 3 languages in a trench coat. Another great example is how different gestures can have completely different meanings in different languages or cultures. So for example, in some of Latin America and Spain, at least before COVID, I'm not totally sure on if people still do it or not, people greeted each other with a kiss on the cheek. In America, a kiss on the cheek is seen as a semi-romantic gesture, but this is not the case in Latin America or Spain. They just see it as a greeting. Another example, I tried to find it, but I couldn't find the country. I want to say it's either Myanmar or somewhere in Southeast Asia, where to get the attention of their server, they do a kissing motion, and it's normal, totally normal. That's just how they call their servers. Whereas, of course, in America, if you did that to a server, they probably wouldn't appreciate it very much. So language can be thought of in 4 different levels of analysis. Yes, we're talking levels of analysis again, but these are slightly different than the ones previously discussed. So the first is phonemes, which is a category of sounds our vocal apparatus produces. Next are morphemes, which are the smallest meaningful unit of speech. Syntax, which are grammatical rules that govern how words are composed into meaningful strings. Extralinguistic information, which are elements of communication that aren't part of the content of language, but are critical to interpreting its meaning. Some good examples are facial expressions and body language. And these can all be thought of as elements in a dining experience. So first, phonemes. These can be thought of as the ingredients in the meal. These categories are influenced by elements of our vocal tract, like our lips, tongue, teeth, and the actual vibration of our vocal cords. Experts tend to disagree on the total number of phonemes globally, but some believe it's around 100. Of course, different languages have different phonemes. Asiatic languages tend to have more due to relying on much more minor changes to indicate different meanings. While there is some overlap between languages, some phonemes are present in some languages, but not others. And this can add to the complexity and difficulty of learning a new language. Next, we have morphemes, which can be thought of as the menu items available at the restaurant. These are created by stringing together phonemes. Most of these are words, like sad, happy. They also convey information about semantics, which is meaning derived from words and sentences. We also have sounds that aren't words, but are still morphemes, like prefixes and suffixes, like re, which means to do it again, as well as ology, which means the study of. Next, we have syntax, which can be thought of as assembling the meal. And this isn't just word order. It also includes morphological markers and sentence structure. So morphological markers are morphemes that change the meaning of a word based on a grammatical rule. For example, adding ing to Google to mean that you are using Google to search something. For example, I'm Googling it right now. While syntax describes how language is organized, real-world language rarely follows this perfectly. For example, if you took stenographical notes on my lectures, which meaning word for word, you'd notice I violate these at least a few times per lecture, and the same can be said for most of your other professors as well. This is part of why language takes so much cognitive processing. We have to interpret what other people are saying. Next, we have extra-linguistic information, and this can be thought of as the overall dining experience. A lot of time we think of language as self-explanatory. We say what we mean and mean what we say. I don't know about y'all, but my parents taught me this was not true. This is why we take a lot of additional information for granted when we interpret language. Extra-linguistic information isn't language, but it gives us context in regards to the language we are interpreting. These include gestures, body language, and facial expressions, as well as tone. This is one reason it's difficult to perfectly interpret language through text. And why so many misunderstandings occur when trying to interpret language that is said through text. For example, depending on the conversation, someone saying, "This is great," can have a multitude of different meanings. If they seem upset, we can assume they're being sarcastic. "Oh, this is just great." If they seem happy, then we can assume they're being sincere. "This is great." And next we have language dialects, which are regional and cultural differences in dining experience. As I mentioned earlier, each language has its own phonemes, morphemes, and syntax. There's variability within as well as across languages. So a dialect is a language variation used by a group of people who share geographic proximity or ethnic background. For example, most of the South has a similar dialect with minor variations. As I mentioned at the beginning of this section, there can be different dialects even within a state. Another comparison is Texan dialect versus New York dialect. I had no idea what a hero or a hoagie were before I worked with a guy from New York. My parents didn't know what breakfast tacos were until I took them to Mama Margie's when they came to visit me. And dialects aren't distinct languages, they're just variations of the same language. The chapter mentions how people tend to assume that those who don't speak the dominant dialect are trying and failing to speak that dialect. This is kind of weird to me because they don't mention that this varies by region, which it may not. This is partial speculation on my part. So, in most places there is a dominant regional dialect, but typically not one national dialect. For example, if someone from New York who speaks a New York dialect came to Texas, Texans would recognize. So if someone with a New York dialect came to Texas, Texans would recognize they aren't speaking a Texan dialect. The same is true when a Texan visits somewhere out of state. They know we aren't locals, but they also know we aren't trying to speak their dialect. And this is likely because we're speaking two variants of what is perceived as proper English. However, if someone was to assume that someone was poorly speaking a given dialect, this could lead to undue prejudice towards that person. One example of this prejudice is individuals who speak African American Vernacular English, AAVE, who might say, "Can I ask you a question?" instead of "Can I ask you a question?" Things like this tend to cause problems for these individuals, especially in the education system. I've seen former classmates be corrected by several teachers that the correct way to say it is, "Can I ask you a question?" which is not entirely true. In AAVE, speakers typically say, "Can I ask you a question?" Just because it isn't the dominant dialect doesn't make it wrong. Having the perception of what is the right or wrong way to say something dictated by dialect can be problematic, because it may cost the person speaking the non-dominant dialect valuable social, educational, and professional opportunities, like being ignored by a teacher or losing a job. Now, one clear advantage of language is that it allows us to communicate very complex thoughts. Some evolutionary theorists believe we developed language as we developed a more complex social system. Traces of this can be seen in gorillas. Coco the gorilla could speak American Sign Language. Another reason they believe we developed language was complex activities like hunting. We had to be able to properly communicate how we were going to hunt and kill the mammoth, or buffalo, or whatever creature we were hunting at the time. While evolutionary psychologists don't agree often, they do agree that language must provide a much greater advantage to people than it does a disadvantage. It does provide some disadvantages, like having a vocal tract makes us capable of choking, but it must provide us a great advantage for our species to risk death to develop it. One challenge to figuring out how language is developed is how arbitrary it can be. For example, slang changes every couple years. I might only be 25, but I have no idea what some of the slang means these days. I still use slang from the early 2000s. However, my new favorite hobby is incorrectly using current slang to bother my younger brother, who actually does know what it means. It's a lot of fun. If you have younger siblings, I encourage you to try it. Additionally, a lot of phonemes, morphemes, and syntax are unrelated to what they actually mean. Some theorists believe the use of arbitrary words allows our language to be more flexible to express complex ideas and emotions. However, there are some words that do convey what they mean. These are onomatopoeias, which are words that convey sounds like beep and boop. Another interesting example is how the word for mother is very similar across numerous languages, the same for father. This is because some of the earliest sounds children can make are ma, pa, and da. And research on sound symbolism, the fact that certain speech sounds seem to be associated with particular meanings, challenges the notion that language is arbitrary even further. So, sound symbolism, or some symbolism, is even consistent across languages. And this poses an interesting possibility that connections between auditory and other sensory systems in the brain influenced how languages evolved in the first place. So, how do children learn language? So children actually learn language a lot more quickly and efficiently than adults do. This is why if you want to learn a new language, it's easier to do so when you're younger. Also, fetuses develop their auditory system around 5 months to the point where they can hear their mom's voice and learn to recognize it and some of the mom's native language. So scientists were able to determine this using a form of operant conditioning. This technique is a high amplitude sucking procedure. God, I hate the name. That takes advantage of one of the few behaviors that infants have control over, sucking. So 2-day-old infants suck on a pacifier more when they hear their mother's native language than when they hear a non-native language to their mother. And this is true for both children of English-speaking and Spanish-speaking mothers, implying that this may be a cross-cultural phenomenon that has an evolutionary base. So during the first year or so of life, infants learn a lot about their native language and begin to figure out phonemes and how to use their vocal structure to create these sounds. While the babbling of kids is nonsense, it plays an important role in language development by enabling babies to figure out how to move their vocal tracts to generate sounds. Babbling evolves over the first year of life and follows a progression of stages, demonstrating infants' increasing control over their vocal tracts. As infants fine-tune their vocal tract, they also fine-tune their hearing. So most babies have the same phonemes regardless of their native language, but as they fine-tune it, they adjust their phonemes rapidly. By 10 months, infants' phoneme categories appear to be very similar to adult speakers of their native language. So the main principle that describes word learning is comprehension precedes production, meaning kids need to learn what a word means before they'll say it. Kids learn to recognize and interpret words well before they produce them. This is because they have a limited ability to coordinate words to produce recognizable sounds. Children start to produce their first words around their first birthdays, but there is a lot of variability there. They also acquire their first words slowly. Between 1 and 1.5, kids gradually accumulate a vocabulary of between 20 and 100 words. As kids become more adept at acquiring words, the rate at which they do so increases, and the difference between the words they know and the words they can say narrows. Kids often make consistent mistakes in interpreting what words mean, often by over or underextending. This means they apply them in a broader sense, overextending, than adults, or in a narrower sense, which is underextending. That's why a lot of kids call all animals dogs or cats, even when the animal is really a horse or a cow. So, syntactic development is putting it all together. So the first major milestone in children's development of language is learning to string words together into phrases. Kids start in the one-word phase, which is early period of language development when children use single-word phrases to convey an entire thought. For example, they might just say dog to express that they see a dog. By the time kids are 2, they start combining words into 2-word phrases. While these are far from full sentences, they make what the kid is saying a lot more comprehensible. At this stage, kids already understand some syntactic rules. Several months after they've started using 2-word phrases, children use more complex sentences involving 3 and 4-word combos. Around the same time, kids also start to produce morphological markers, like knowing how to add an S to make a word plural. They acquire most syntactic rules by the time they're preschool age, but they continue to acquire more complex rules in their early school years. So next we have bilingualism, which is the ability to speak 2 languages fluently. So part of the reason it's hard for adults to learn a second language is because people typically master one language more easily by living in a community that speaks it than we do learning it in a classroom. If you want to learn a second language and maintain your knowledge of that language, you need to speak it on a regular basis. The best way to learn a second language is to be exposed to it at a young age. The younger the better. Most bilingual people have a dominant language, and it's usually the first language they learned, the one they heard most as a child, and the one they used most often. In other words, it's usually, but not always, their native language. However, there are instances in which a child is exposed to 2 languages in parallel. For example, having one or both parents be bilingual would expose the child to all of the parents' spoken languages. This can also happen if the child has a caretaker who speaks a different language than their parents. So one example of this is my former boss. Her mom stays with her and helps take care of her son. Her mom only speaks Vietnamese, so her mom is exposing my former boss's son to Vietnamese on a regular basis. So there's a really high chance that, like my former boss, her son will also be bilingual in both English and Vietnamese. Kids learning 2 languages follow the same process as a child who is only learning 1 language. There is some evidence that bilingual kids experience a delay in syntax development in each of their languages relative to their monolinguistic counterparts, but vocabulary development is relatively unimpaired. However, these early impairments are outweighed by many long-term benefits. For example, this gives them heightened metalinguistic insight, which is awareness of how language is structured and used. Additionally, when someone already knows 2 languages, it becomes easier for them to learn a third. Linguists have also examined critical periods. So, as we know, kids learn language easier than adults, and most of this research has stemmed from research on second language acquisition. This is mostly focused on if there's a critical period for language development. So critical periods are windows of time in development when an organism must learn an ability if it's going to learn it at all. For example, one study found that those exposed to a second language at a younger age were better at noticing small errors in grammar. And this is called an age of exposure effect. And these are most pronounced in syntax and pronunciation, but not so much for vocabulary. So, for obvious ethical reasons, we can't deprive kids of language, but some are naturally deprived due to various causes. These unfortunate events give researchers a unique opportunity to study these events. One example is a girl named Jeannie who was severely neglected and abused for the first 13 years of her life. Once she was rescued, she demonstrated a very impaired ability to communicate, meaning she couldn't use language fluently. Granted, this potentially could be due to the horrible abuse and neglect. And that is one downside to studying events like this, is they can't really rule out rival hypotheses. However, one researcher, Susan Golden Meadow, yes, that is her actual name, found a way to still study first language critical periods that is able to rule out rival hypotheses. She examined deaf kids without hearing parents, but the parents didn't know sign language. She found that most deaf kids of hearing parents tended to invent their own signs, even when not instructed in sign language. This is described as home sign, which is the system of signs invented by kids who are deaf-born to hearing parents and receive no language input. Without exposure to a structured language model like American Sign Language, home signers never really developed full-blown language. Unfortunately, this still doesn't tell us if there is a specific age that is critical, or that is a critical period for language development. But further research built on this by studying deaf kids born to hearing parents that receive cochlear implants at different ages. So cochlear implants allow these kids to receive auditory input. They tend to have more positive effects on those who receive them at a younger age, but it's not clear if these effects are the result of the brain's ability to process and interpret the auditory stimulation in general, or the ability to learn language specifically. While it's obvious that the age of acquisition affects how well someone is able to learn a language, there doesn't seem to be any evidence in favor of or against the existence of a strict critical period. And this is why language learning is talked about as having a sensitive period, which is a time in which people are more receptive to learning and can acquire new knowledge more easily, instead of a strict either they have to know it or they're not going to learn it. So theories about language acquisition. So the first couple are pure nature and nurture theories. So the simplest explanation of how kids learn language is they learn through imitation. They hear adults use language in a structured way and learn from hearing adults speak. However, imitation doesn't entirely explain language acquisition because language is generative, which means it allows an infinite number of unique sentences to be created by combining words in novel ways. The strongest nature view is the nativist view, which suggests that children are born with some basic knowledge of how language works. Proponents of this approach are born with, or believe, that kids are born with expectations that there will be syntactic rules that influence how sentences are constructed, but the exact rules for their native language need to be determined through exposure. So Noam Chomsky believed that people have a language organ in their brain that he called the language acquisition device, and that holds the rules of syntax. So a key weakness of this account is that many of its claims are difficult to falsify, and as I hope you all remember from, I believe it was chapter 1, chapter 2, falsification is very important, especially for scientific theories. If it can't be proven wrong, it doesn't really prove anything. Next, we have the social pragmatics approach, and this is the approach to language acquisition that proposes that children infer what words and sentences mean from context and social interactions. Like every other approach, this one has its weaknesses. So basing language acquisition on social understanding implies that infants understand a great deal about how other people are thinking. Additionally, we can explain most social pragmatic abilities without requiring as much insight on the part of the child. One example is how most social pragmatic theorists might say that children learn to interpret meaning from pointing because children recognize that the speaker's communicative goal is to direct the child's attention to a particular object. However, there is a possibility that children notice that every time their caretaker points to a specific object, the caretaker uses the same word. In this way, kids may infer that pointing is correlated with word meaning. Can't talk today. This deduction doesn't require kids to take into account the social context or communication intention of others. Next, we have general cognitive processing, and this idea proposes that children's ability to learn language results from general skills that children apply and recognize patterns. And maybe all they need to learn is language. So children's ability to perceive, learn, and recognize patterns, maybe all they need to learn language. Oh, that is redundant. Of course, there are challenges to this approach as well. One is that children are better at learning languages than adults, whereas adults are better at learning things in general. Another is that specific areas of the brain, especially in the left temporal lobe, are more active in language processing than in other types of learning, memory, and pattern recognition. So I wanted to talk about the brain areas involved in language. This is a bit of a throwback to chapter 3, but with just a little bit more depth. So Broca's area, which is located in the left hemisphere, is associated with speech production and articulation. Our ability to articulate ideas as well as use words accurately in spoken and written languages has been attributed to this area. As we can see here, it's the orange one on the left. And we also have Wernicke's area, and this is a critical language area in the posterior superior temporal lobe. So it's this dark red area in the picture. And it connects to Broca's area via a neural pathway, which is these little black loopy loops. So Wernicke's area is primarily involved in comprehension of speech. Historically, this area has been associated with language processing, whether it is written or spoken. And there's a lot more to this system. You can see multiple other things just laid out in this picture, but the actual depth of it is well beyond the scope of this class. However, if any of you are interested in learning more, I am going to post a research article along with the slides for those curious. And then each area also has an associated aphasia, which is a disorder that involves problems with language. So Broca's aphasia is damage to this area of the brain has been shown to significantly affect the use of spontaneous speech and motor speech control. So words may be uttered very slowly or very poorly articulated. Speech may be labored and consists primarily of nouns, verbs, or important adjectives. Speech takes on a very telegraphic character. So people suffering from Broca's aphasia have a really hard time with repetition and a severe impairment in writing. Granted, both of these do depend on the extent of the damage, but still. In some patients, however, the understanding of spoken and written language may be relatively well preserved. And in Wernicke's aphasia, damage to this area has been shown to significantly affect speech comprehension. In other words, information is heard through an intact auditory system, but when it arrives at Wernicke's area, the information can't be sufficiently translated. So in contrast to Broca's aphasia, a person with Wernicke's aphasia talks very volubly, so very loud, and gestures very frequently. Speech is produced without effort, and sentences are of normal length. However, the person's speech is typically devoid of meaning. Like the brain areas, there are a bunch of different types of aphasia. I just wanted to provide a few examples of where language or communication between language areas can go wrong. So in animals, their communication primarily takes place in two circumstances: violence and sex. So birds use bird calls to communicate, chimpanzees use vocalizations and body language. The list goes on. I'm sure you can readily think of multiple examples of how animals communicate. However, one important note I do want to add here is one of the weird variants of this is cats don't meow at other cats when they're no longer a kitten. So like only kittens meow at other cats. Cats meow at us, but not to other adult cats. And there are a couple theories behind this. The main one is they think we're big dumb cats that are terrible at taking care of ourselves, so that's why they meow at us. As far as teaching human language to non-human animals, it can be done. Remember when I mentioned Coco earlier? She knew sign language really well. However, most animals can't be taught human language. The two exceptions are bonobos, which is a type of ape, and parrots. Yeah, parrots. I was going to include it, but I forgot. There's a pretty funny scene in Family Guy where Joe gets a parrot and Peter teaches it to say all sorts of horrible things, and it's entertaining. It's ableist, though. That's part of why I didn't want to include it. But it is entertaining, and you can find a bunch of different videos of people teaching their parrots various swear words and other things that would not be appropriate to include in the lecture. So, if you're interested, Google. Alrighty, as far as reading. So, our spelling conventions date back to the root of the word and the evolution of language. So, evolutionary speaking, reading is a very new skill for humans. We don't develop it naturally like learning, perception, and memory, but it can be taught and learned. Eventually, reading does become automatic, so it no longer takes up as much of our cognitive resources. Typically, it becomes so automatic that by the time you get to college, you can't turn it off even if you wanted to. And a great demonstration of how automatic our reading ability is the Stroop test. Now, if we were in person, I would have y'all do it, so I'm going to do my best to recreate that. So let's see here. So for this, you have to say what color the word is, not what the word says. So for example, for the first word here, the correct answer would be red, not purple. So just go with me through the list, reading left to right, and keep track of how many times you made a mistake. I'm going to use a tally system, my little notepad. Alright. So, of course, first we have red, purple, green, I believe that's black, blue, yellow, yellow, black, black, blue, red, blue, green, blue, red. So if you feel like you struggled with this a little bit, you are not alone. It is perfectly normal to do that. or to struggle with it. This really demonstrates how hard it is to turn off your reading abilities. So beginning readers have to learn a lot of both spoken and written language before they can read. While children are typically quite fluent speakers by the time they learn to read, their knowledge of the phonology of their language is largely implicit, so they don't possess a conscious awareness of it. This means that kids don't realize what words look like when written or what assembly of letters has the same meaning as the noise that they produce. So kids can take two paths to reading words. The first is learning to recognize familiar words when they see them printed on a page. Without this skill, reading can't become automatic. The average reader uses whole word recognition, which is a reading strategy that involves identifying common words based on their appearance without having to sound them out. And this skill is accomplished by first developing phonetic decomposition, which is a reading strategy that involves sounding out words by drawing correspondences between printed letters and sounds, commonly known as phonics. Stay hooked on phonics, kids! I apologize for that joke. Alrighty, so this is just some quick housekeeping. So chapter 10 and the exam will be up this weekend. Chapters 6, 8, and 10 quizzes are due October 30th. Exam 2 is due November 1st. Chapter 11 will not be on exam 2. And to account for this, I'm going to add a 5th quiz for exam 3 that will likely be cumulative across the chapters we've covered. Again, make sure you're attending your SI sessions with Kelly. I apologize for how long it took me to get this up. Office hours this week are 3 to 5. Well, this week, as in the week of October 20th. I will not have office hours on, let me check the date real quick. On October 28th, I have to have surgery. It's minor surgery, don't worry about me. But just kind of a forewarning, I will be not having office hours the 28th, and I will probably also be out of pocket for a couple days. I will do my best to answer emails, but some might slip through the cracks. So highly, highly, highly encourage everyone, get your stuff done early, so that way if you do have questions or you do have issues, I can address them when I'm not in a zonked out, when I'm not zonked out on post-surgery medication. So